Many, especially in Greece, blame the markets, the bad markets, the hedge funds, the people who just want to make money out of Greece for the state of the economy. If it were not for the markets, they say, things would not have been that bad or would have been completely different. If Greece was a closed market model or a closed market economy, things would have been different. What is your input on this matter? Are the free markets or that model, the financial model, a cure or a disease for Greece?
Well, I think that the mentality you described is like blaming canaries for mine disasters. The canary somehow is responsible because it died. Well, the fact is that what markets told us was that there were fundamental problems at the base, and to blame markets for it is, in my opinion, absurd and ridiculous. It was the fundamentals that were out of whack, and markets were what alerted us to this problem. The fact of the matter is that, facilitated by state financial regulation, by Basel Accords, by pushing private credit markets out and replacing them with regulation and state determination, we generated a bankrupt state. Really, Greece is effectively a bankrupt state. They're not able to meet their obligations. The number of new employees brought on in just 5 years, over 100,000 new employees added to the payroll in a relatively small country. This is enormous. The reduction in the retirement age, people working for shorter periods of time, but with extended lifespan. That means that they're going to be retired and drawing incomes for a longer period of time. The arithmetic didn't add up. It was fundamentally unsound. And it's not the fault of markets for ringing the bell to tell us that it's a mistake. It's like blaming fire alarms for fires.
And what about the remedy? We talked about the problem. What about the remedy? A lot of Greeks and the Troika, of course, speak about reforms. And reforms is a word very oftenly used in Greece at this time. Which sectors of the economy and the government do you think are in a dire need of change, and how can this change be implemented?
Well, first off, they're not even doing much in the way of reforms. They keep talking about reform processes, which is to say, not making hard decisions. In the present circumstance, I think that they need to make difficult choices. It means getting around the table and saying what is affordable and what is not, paying attention to arithmetic to make sure that the revenues add up and can support the expenditures, and then making decisions on what is affordable and what is not. The approach that's been taken so far, a kind of haircut, we just make general cuts so everyone gets such and such a percentage, is, in my opinion, short-sighted. It generates what looks like a short-term reform, but it doesn't address the long-term fundamentals. There are too many activities of governments that are useless. They're not generating any value, but taxpayers have to pay taxes to support that. To deal with that means looking at the ministries, looking at all the government expenditures and determining what is affordable and what is not, and cutting and eliminating ministries that don't add value. Why should taxpayers have to pay their hard-earned money for people who are not adding any value? And that is where, as they say in English, the rubber meets the road, is actually cutting out functions, agencies, and even whole ministries of the government, rather than just making these cosmetic changes of shaving off so many percentage points.
Some people say that the euro is to blame for all of this. Had it not been for the common currency, Greece would not have been in this state. Do you think the euro is a curse or is it a blessing for Greece?
At one level, I think it was a bit of a curse, because I think that admitting Greece into the Eurozone without having met the criterion, and when everybody in the political decision knew at the time that the criteria had not been met, allowed decision makers and the government to issue bonds and to be able to get effectively German rates on them, when really they should have paid more. That would have been a powerful feedback mechanism to the political regime, allowing the markets to tell the truth to them. But the political decision to bring Greece into the euro, I do think, had a negative consequence. It enabled irresponsible behavior. That said, it's a bit like blaming the bartender for the drunk's bad behavior. The bartender should know not to continue bringing the drinks, but the Greek politicians were the ones who drank them. And there is also responsibility here in Greece on the part of the political elite, who I think failed the country.
So at the end of the day, would you be pro-euro or against euro, given the time frame and the situation we're in now?
In the current circumstance, it's difficult to say. You can see arguments pro and con. On the one hand, the euro does reduce some transactions costs. It makes it easier for tourists to come here. If they're coming from a Eurozone country, it's easier to calculate and so on. So it has some benefits to lower the transactions cost of doing business, to lower currency transactions costs, and to increase certainty among visitors. On the other hand, it means that Greece is not able to devalue if that were an appropriate response, and it limits some of the possibilities of rational responses. I think one option would be to move towards embracing the euro, but without being part of the European Central Bank. Now that may sound odd, but there are many countries in the world that have adopted the currencies of external zones without being part of the monetary mechanism. So Panama uses the US dollar, for example. Many different countries do that. Or another option would be to effectively have a currency board that would maintain a Greek euro at a one-to-one parity with the euro from the Eurozone. I do think that that might have some benefits by getting them out of the European Central Bank, but still allow the ease of transaction and business across borders by eliminating currency uncertainty.
Do you think there is room for liberal ideas in Greece? What advice would you give to the Greek libertarians, given the current state of affairs?
Well, I think there's definitely room for libertarian or classical liberal ideas in Greece. And in my opinion, it's a constructive addition to the discourse. It means focusing on what is the proper role of the state, what does the state do that adds value to the society, and what does the state do that detracts or subtracts value from social interaction. And we have both. There are activities of the state that are necessary for the maintenance of public order, the judicial system, and so on. But there are so many that make life harder for people. They just add burdens and costs and increase transactions costs on them. It tends to be the classical liberals or libertarians who focus on those questions. And one of the reasons why I think they make a very positive contribution to political discourse is they don't believe in magic. Unlike many other people, they focus on institutions, rules, and processes that are likely to generate better outcomes by aligning incentives correctly. It means a more scientific approach, which is how I fundamentally understand classical liberalism. It's the application of reason to human interaction and trying to study how societies produce social cooperation. What is the role of incentives? How do you get incentives aligned as opposed to being at cross purposes? That, to me, is a very positive contribution to a democratic culture. So I think libertarians are a very vital part of helping Greek people to rescue their own democracy and their own economic future.
However, given the results of the previous elections and the polls, the liberal idea in general seems to be underrepresented in Greece. What advice would you give, and why do you see that happening, given the rationale behind the liberal idea?
Well, I think one thing that's happened is we found it's very easy for people to blame outsiders for problems, conspiracies, foreigners, Jews, minorities, and so on. It's easy for people to blame them. And so there was a rise of extremist political parties, very anti-liberal, collectivist parties that are mirror images of each other on the far right and on the far left. These essentially mirror each other. The liberal view is about explaining to people in terms they can understand that there are limits to the ability of power to change behavior, that incentives matter, and explaining to people in terms that are matters of normal human discussion about household budgets and, frankly, about arithmetic. And there, I think the Greek liberals need to do a better job, but I think that they can and will make a positive contribution to a democratic outcome.
You have visited Greece quite a few times during the recent years. What change do you witness compared to your previous visit, if any? And is it change to the better or is it change to the worse?
Well, to be very honest, I've been extremely concerned by the vision of frightening extremist movements rising and getting representation in Parliament and European Parliament, I do think this is rather shocking, and it is a sign that the country is in a very serious crisis, because those movements would take it in such, I think, a negative and destructive direction, because they're fantasy movements. They think that somehow a magical transformation is going to take place, that magically the country will become prosperous or equal or racially pure, whatever left-wing or right-wing fantasy they have in mind. So that does disturb me. But it means that the forces of the center, by which I identify with liberalism, with libertarianism, the forces of the center need to make their case more clearly, and they need to speak to the millions of quiet Greeks, the people who go to work, who pay their taxes, who live normal lives, and get them engaged in the political discussion. So that is the task facing libertarians in Greece, to speak to the majority of people who are not engaged and bring them into politics.
So that would be the message you'd give to the Greek liberal or libertarian politicians? And what about the voters themselves? What message would you give to them?
Don't believe fantasy promises that sound too good to be true. I think that's really important. People who promise you paradise, and certainly people who blame all the problems externally. As we discussed, there are external reasons, such as admission into the Eurozone, when Greece, to be honest, should not have been admitted into the Euro to begin with. But at the same time, look to the internal sources of the problem and the Greek political elite who failed this country because they were short-term oriented. They made promises to people that yielded short-term benefits for them, but had terrible long-term liabilities. In the short term, it looks fine. Everyone is moving along until you start to have those bills come due in the future. Greece is now in the long term, and now is the time when those bills have to be paid, and it means a more adult mentality among voters to say, what are we going to do now to clean up the problems our politicians created for us in the past?